The metallic click of a deadbolt sliding into the strike plate is supposed to mean you are safe. We put our faith in that half inch of steel, drawing the blinds and shutting our eyes, convinced the world stops at the property line. It doesn't. Some of the worst predators don't have to break a window or pick a lock to get inside. They just wait for you to look the other way. I'm Mason Gray. Let's open the file. December 27th hit Oak Haven, Ohio, with a dry, biting wind that froze the slush on the sidewalks. Ice clung to the aluminum siding of the small convenience store attached to the front of Helen Weaver's house. Normally, the 68-year-old woman unlocked the main entrance by 7 in the morning. Today, the metal security grate remained pulled shut. Her niece stood on the concrete step, wrapping a wool scarf tighter around her neck, knocking a gloved fist against the glass. No movement came from inside. Walking around the perimeter of the property, the young woman headed for the residential entrance at the rear. Dead leaves crunched beneath her soles. She gripped the brass handle of the back door, leaning her weight into it. The hinges gave way with a stiff squeak, swinging open into the mudroom. Immediately, the temperature inside felt artificially high, the furnace working overtime to push dry air through the vents. Taking a few steps over the threshold, she called out her aunt's name. A steady hum from the kitchen refrigerator offered the only response. The odor of stale dust and faint mildew hung stagnant in the hallway. Moving past the kitchen island, the niece approached the first-floor bedroom. Wooden floorboards creaked under her weight. Helen's bed sat against the far wall. A heavy, floral-patterned winter quilt rested unnaturally high, obscuring the pillows completely. Relief briefly washed over the young woman, assuming her aunt had simply decided to sleep out the morning freeze. Stepping closer to the edge of the mattress, she noticed the room felt entirely too still. The fabric over the bed didn't rise or fall. Reaching out, her bare hand caught the hem of the dense bedding. She pulled it downward. Helen's eyes pointed toward the ceiling, fixed and vacant. Jagged red abrasions tracked aggressively across her throat and cheeks, contrasting violently against the pale grey of her skin. The niece staggered backward, losing her footing on the polished wood. A ragged gasp tore from her lungs as she scrambled toward the hallway, fumbling blindly for the phone in her coat pocket. The static burst of a dispatcher's radio sliced through the stagnant air. Heavy winter boots ground wet, grey slush into the hardwood floor as Oak Haven patrol units locked down the perimeter. Yellow crime scene tape snapped taut against the freezing December wind. Inside the house, the furnace's artificial heat felt suffocating. Warm drafts carried the distinct, coppery tang of recent violence mixed with the mundane scent of old dust. Detective Miller stepped over the threshold, his jaw clenched tight against the overwhelming temperature. Peeling off his leather gloves, the investigator paused. Scanning the first-floor bedroom, he noted the space radiated an unnatural energy. Death rarely looks tidy. Yet, the area around the mattress possessed a calculated neatness. A heavy floral quilt lay tucked with meticulous precision, smoothed flat at the edges. Whoever left Helen Weaver here wanted to project an illusion of restful slumber. That staged facade was meant to secure a crucial head start. Moving closer, the coroner lowered a halogen floodlight over the body. Harsh white beams illuminated the reality beneath the fabric. Deep, purple-black contusions ringed the victim's neck, mapping the aggressive compression of a strangulation. Microscopic flecks of grit clung to her grey hair. Dried leaves and splintered wood shavings were matted against her scalp. Those specific debris particles didn't belong in a freshly made bed. They originated from the floor below. Kneeling beside the staircase, Miller focused his attention downward. Tracing his flashlight across the scuffed baseboards, he found violently swept dust bunnies. An erratic smear of mud tracked upward toward the landing. The true narrative crystallized instantly. Helen hadn't passed quietly under the covers. She fought desperately on the lower level, kicking against the hardwood before the assailant dragged her lifeless weight upstairs. A uniform officer poked his head through the doorway, keeping his voice tight. Out in the shop, the cash register sat entirely empty. $3,500 in holiday float had vanished. While the motive screamed cheap greed, the execution felt uncomfortably intimate. Inspection of the rear deadbolt showed zero signs of forced entry. No shattered glass littered the mat. Intact wood framed the entrance completely. Surveying the aggressively cleaned room, Miller felt an undeniable conclusion settle heavily in his gut. This culprit understood the layout of the property flawlessly. Familiarity dictated the victim's routine to the intruder. Furthermore, the attacker managed to secure the back door from the inside before fleeing into the freezing morning. Therefore, the monster wasn't some random drifter blowing through town on the interstate. Was it possible the killer was standing right outside the perimeter tape, watching the coroner zip the bag shut? The solid brass deadbolt clicked with a hollow, metallic thwack inside the plastic evidence bag. Detective Miller rolled the cold cylinder between his latex-covered fingers, searching for any sign of a struggle. It bore 0 scratches. No iron crowbar had splintered the surrounding doorframe. Whoever entered Helen Weaver's house hadn't forced their way inside. They simply walked through the rear mudroom like a welcomed guest. A quiet, deeply unsettling intimacy lingered over that intact piece of hardware. Random burglars smash glass. They kick in wooden panels. This intruder treated the property with the casual familiarity of a resident. Late December brings a chaotic migration to Oakhaven, muddying the investigative waters. Transients drift down the icy interstate looking for warmth, while long-haul truckers kill time in diner booths smelling intensely of diesel fuel and burnt coffee. For 48 agonizing hours, the task force chased ghosts along the highway corridors. Investigators dragged men with road grit under their fingernails into cramped, windowless interview rooms. Harsh fluorescent tubes hummed violently overhead as detectives dissected strained alibis. The air in those holding cells grew stale, with the sour stench of unwashed clothes and nervous sweat. Relatives visiting from out of state were questioned until their voices cracked. One by one, however, the drifters and the out-of-towners produced bulletproof receipts. Gas station security stamps and toll booth tickets systematically cleared the outsiders. Science rarely cares about a detective's convenience. Forensics isolated the precise point of entry, forcing the narrative to pivot sharply inward. Helen kept a rigidly paranoid evening routine. She engaged that backlatch every night at exactly 9 o'clock. To bypass her security required either a stolen key or the highly specific knowledge that she occasionally left a secondary window unlatched during harsh winter drafts. A wandering transient off the highway wouldn't know about a faulty catch on a secluded back porch. A passing trucker wouldn't understand that the convenience store's cash float sat vulnerable in a cigar box during the holiday weekend. Miller shifted the precinct's spotlight entirely. He turned his back on the transient routes and faced the quiet, snow-choked streets of the victim's own subdivision. City plows had pushed towering drifts against the curbs overnight, creating high white walls between the identical suburban houses. The rhythmic, scraping screech of metal snow shovels grinding against concrete echoed down the frost-bitten block. Plainclothes detectives began pounding on aluminum screen doors. They stood on slippery porches, exhaling thick plumes of white breath, meticulously observing the micro-expressions of the people who lived mere yards from the crime scene. Every neighborly conversation felt artificially rehearsed. Housewives clutched woolen cardigans tight against the biting wind, offering weak smiles alongside vague, empty condolences. Middle-aged men leaned their weight on wooden handles, their eyes darting nervously down the street before answering the most basic procedural questions. The neighborhood oxygen tasted heavily of pine wood smoke and unspoken paranoia. Locals eagerly gossiped about the dead store owner's eccentricities, yet absolutely nobody admitted to hearing a single muffled scream or a creaking floorboard. An entire street of light sleepers all claimed to have been dead to the world. Someone in this tight-knit grid of homes was bleeding a lie. Crime scene technicians pouring casting plaster into the hardened mud behind Helen's property discovered a glaring anomaly. The indented boot footprints didn't lead toward the main arterial road. Those deep, aggressive treads pivoted sharply away from the commercial escape routes. They tracked directly down the residential alleyway, moving silently past a row of snow-capped backyard fences. The killer hadn't fled to a getaway car after crushing Helen's throat. He had casually walked home. As Miller studied the tracks disappearing into a snowbank just 5 houses down, a sickening question lodged in his throat. Which one of these politely grieving neighbors was currently scrubbing the old woman's skin cells out from under his fingernails? The screeching mechanical rewind of a microcassette tape pierced the suffocating heat of the cramped precinct office. Detective Miller pressed the heavy plastic play button, leaning his ear dangerously close to the dusty mesh speaker. A raspy, nicotine-stained whisper hissed through the analog static, eventually coughing up a highly specific name: Travis Vance. 26 years old. Lived exactly 4 houses down from the artificially staged bedroom. His juvenile jacket sat thick in the archives, stained with years of petty, opportunistic burglary charges. That single, breathless, anonymous call instantly shifted the entire gravitational pull of the homicide task force. They stopped chasing phantom highway truckers and dropped their nets directly onto a cracked suburban driveway. Vice cops immediately began mapping the young man's recent movements, unearthing a painfully pathetic trail of cheap desperation. 72 hours before Helen Weaver's windpipe was crushed against her own floorboards, Travis sat sweating profusely in an illegal, high-stakes poker game tucked behind a dilapidated local dive bar. Stale malt liquor, unwashed bodies, and damp fungal rot soaked the unventilated basement air. He hemorrhaged borrowed money across the green felt table, his pupils dilated with rising panic. Losing his entire wallet wasn't nearly enough punishment. He desperately needed a fresh stake to win it all back before sunrise. Financial panic breeds a very specific, aggressive flavor of stupidity. Borrowing his brother-in-law's pristine, navy blue Ford F-150 under the flimsy guise of running late-night errands, Travis drove straight to the industrial edge of town. He parked under the harsh, flickering pink neon of a 24-hour predatory auto title lender. Broken fluorescent tubes hummed a sickening, arrhythmic beat inside the linoleum-floored lobby. He slammed the forged vehicle registration onto the scratched plexiglass counter, walking back into the freezing night with a thick wad of high-interest bills. By 2 a.m, those crisp hundreds had completely evaporated into the underground poker pot. Now, the degenerate gambler didn't just owe dangerous men. He possessed a stolen, pawned truck that his aggressive relatives would inevitably demand back by dawn. The non-negotiable cash price to retrieve that title? Exactly $3,500. Mathematical coincidences rarely exist inside a murder binder. 12 hours after, an intruder meticulously tucked a heavy floral quilt over Helen's vacant, staring eyes. A violently jittery 26-year-old burst through the glass doors of that exact same loan shop. Overhead security footage captured him pacing erratically, chewing his thumb cuticles down to the bleeding quick. He frantically dumped a crinkled, disorganized pile of small denomination bills onto the counter. It was a holiday cash float, smelling faintly of the victim's corner store dust and copper pennies. Travis reclaimed the Ford's pink slip, his bare hands trembling so violently he dropped the metal keys twice on the dirty floor. Miller immediately dispatched tactical units to locate the suspect, but one final, sickening detail from the neighborhood canvas solidified the sheer horror of the timeline. The very night the elderly convenience store owner took her final, violently restricted breath, the Vance family was hosting a solemn gathering inside their own living room, a memorial wake for their recently deceased grandfather. Men in ill-fitting black suits, the overpowering perfume of wilting funeral lilies, and quiet, rhythmic sobbing filled their stifling house. Amidst the collective mourning, Travis casually slid out the rear patio door claiming he needed a quick cigarette. He disappeared into the pitch black, freezing December wind. How many minutes was he actually gone? Just long enough to trudge 4 doors down, shatter a neighbor's throat, and steal a cardboard cigar box stuffed with crumpled 20s. He then walked casually back into his grandfather's wake, poured himself a styrofoam cup of black decaf, and wrapped his arms around his weeping mother. The metallic taste of absolute revulsion flooded Miller's mouth, sticking to his molars. Investigators weren't just hunting a desperate thief. They were actively tracking a dead-eyed predator who could manually choke a frail woman to death and instantly return to play the grieving grandson, holding his own family with hands that hadn't even been scrubbed of a murdered neighbor's skin cells. 50 miles from the aggressively scrubbed murder site, tactical boots kicked in the flimsy plywood door of a rented duplex. Dust mites spiraled in the sudden shaft of afternoon sunlight cutting across the living room. Travis Vance offered zero resistance. Sitting frozen on a sagging floral sofa, a half-eaten bowl of stale cereal rested awkwardly on his knees. The harsh, metallic ratcheting of steel handcuffs echoing off the cheap drywall seemed to snap the suspect out of a heavy, narcotic-like stupor. Officers shoved him into the back of a cruiser, smelling strongly of industrial vinyl and stagnant exhaust fumes. Gazing out the smeared plexiglass divider, his breathing remained shallow, wet, and entirely erratic. Fluorescent tubes buzzed like dying hornets inside interview room A. Detective Miller slid a manila folder across the scratched aluminum table, the thick paper making a harsh, abrasive hiss. Across the divide, the 26-year-old looked physically hollowed out. A deep, nervous tremor vibrated through his leg, knocking rhythmically against the metal chair frame. Miller didn't scream or slam his fists. The veteran investigator merely laid out the unshakable timeline. The dive bar poker game, the pawned title slip, the $3,500 reclaimed just hours after an elderly woman stopped breathing. Denials withered instantly in Travis's throat. His jaw slacked open. Tears cut clean tracks through the greasy layer of sweat coating his pale cheeks. The truth spilling from his cracked lips wasn't some calculated master plan. It reeked of cheap malt liquor and pathetic, overwhelming desperation. Intoxicated and bankrupt, he had stumbled away from the stifling perfume of his grandfather's funeral arrangements. Navigating the icy residential alleyways, intimate knowledge of Helen's routine guided him directly to her rusted exterior gate. Slipping through the unlatched rear mudroom, the artificial warmth of the furnace flooded his frozen, drunken nervous system. Incredibly, instead of immediately ransacking the register, the intruder collapsed against the baseboards. He actually dozed off on the linoleum floor. Saliva pooled by his cheek as he slept peacefully inside the home of the neighbor he was about to extinguish. A sudden rush of freezing winter draft jolted him awake. Helen Weaver had descended the creaking wooden staircase. Softly shuffling slippers aimed to secure the faulty kitchen latch. Floorboards groaned under her weight. Turning her head, she spotted the shadow. Recognition flashed instantly in her tired eyes. The local kid from 4 doors down crouched in her hallway like a cornered animal. Panic violently hijacked Travis's brain. Lunging forward, calloused fingers clamped around her esophagus before a single scream could escape. The 2 bodies violently hit the lower steps. Splinters dug deeply into the attacker's knuckles. Desperate, jagged tracks were clawed across his forearms by her frantic fingernails. Squeezing tighter became his only focus. The immense pressure continued until the kicking subsided into a dull, heavy stillness. Dragging a dead weight upstairs requires immense, sustained physical exertion. Muscle lactic acid burned his shoulders as he hauled her limp form onto the mattress. Arranging the heavy quilt over her bruised face wasn't an act of remorse. Tucking the fabric tightly around her chin simply delayed the inevitable morning discovery. Securing exactly enough hours to raid the cigar box, retrieve the Ford's pink slip, and walk back into his family's morning parlor. 68 years of a quiet, hard-working existence snuffed out on a staircase. And for what? The ultimate price of a human life in Oakhaven boiled down to a handful of crumpled $20 bills and a pawned truck title. Miller snapped the microcassette recorder off. The sharp, plastic click finalized the tape. Silence poured back into the concrete room, heavy and absolute. Standing up, the detective's chair scraped violently against the floorboards as he walked out, leaving a hollowed-out gambler staring blankly at the cinder-block wall. Justice is a concept we invented to help us sleep at night. We like to imagine that a courtroom gavel hitting a block of wood somehow erases the violence, returning the universe to a state of balance. But the ledger never really balances. A conviction doesn't uncrush a windpipe or unsteal a life. Sometimes, the wheels of consequence grind with absolute efficiency, snaring a suspect before their stolen cash is even spent. Other times, those wheels rust. They freeze up for decades, burying the truth so deeply that people start believing monsters are just local folklore. I'm Mason Gray. If you thought our last trip down the highway was bleak, buckle up. We are heading into the mountains, and we are going to be waiting a long, long time for an answer. August 5th, 2007. Thick, suffocating humidity clung to the dense canopy of Blackwood Valley, West Virginia. Heavy spring rains had saturated the Appalachian Holler, transforming the unpaved roads into deep, treacherous ruts of red mud. Danielle Lawson should have been blowing out candles. The owner of the small, isolated trading post and bait shop had just turned 27. Instead of birthday wishes, a sickly, panicked murmur began snaking its way through the valley long before the sun had fully crested the ridgeline. Locals looking to buy morning coffee found the heavy wooden shutters of Danielle's cabin bolted shut from the inside. She never slept past dawn. Whispers morphed into rapid, frantic knocks against the pine door. By 8 o'clock, a lone county deputy arrived, his tires sliding erratically across the wet gravel driveway. Stepping out of the cruiser, the officer noticed an immediate, profound wrongness in the atmosphere. The forest, normally vibrating with the shrill hum of cicadas and rustling underbrush, felt deadened. A heavy, stagnant odor of overturned soil and metallic algae wafted from the rear of the property. Trudging through the ankle-deep muck, the deputy circled toward the back of the trading post. His hand instinctively rested on the leather grip of his sidearm. Attached to the exterior wall sat a massive, circular, concrete rainwater cistern. It provided the only reliable water supply for the isolated cabin. The heavy, iron-banded wooden lid, a cover that required genuine physical effort to move, rested violently askew, exposing a sliver of the dark interior. A cluster of bruised, trampled ferns lay flattened near the base, contrasting sharply with the otherwise undisturbed vegetation. Drawing his maglite, the deputy leaned over the rough, abrasive edge of the concrete rim. He clicked the heavy black switch. A harsh beam of yellow light pierced the murky, algae-stained depths. The reflection didn't bounce off dark water. It caught on a swath of pale, waterlogged skin and dark hair fanning out like a spiderweb across the surface. Danielle Lawson was floating face down in her own drinking water. The back of her skull showed an aggressive, caved-in depression. Danielle wasn't just a shop owner. She was a fixture of the community who walked with a pronounced, lifelong limp. Her mobility was limited, making the idea of an accidental fall over the high lip of the cistern physically impossible. Someone had carried her there. As the deputy fumbled for his radio, his gaze dropped to the ground near the trampled ferns. A single, distinct footprint pressed deeply into the wet clay. The tread pattern belonged to a heavy work boot, completely obliterating a set of delicate, barefoot tracks. Danielle hadn't walked out back alone. She had been dragged, and whoever dragged her had taken the heavy gold locket she wore religiously every single day. Mechanical whining from the bone saw echoed sharply against the stainless steel walls of the county morgue. Formaldehyde vapor burned the investigator's nostrils, yet it completely failed to mask the pungent odor of stagnant, metallic algae clinging to the victim's matted hair. "Doctor," Aris pulled back the heavy plastic sheet, his gloved hands moving with clinical precision. Death by accidental fall was instantly ruled out. A massive, star-shaped laceration deformed the rear curve of Danielle Lawson's skull, exposing splintered white bone fragments beneath the pale scalp. But that violent cranial impact wasn't what permanently stopped her heart. Scalpel blades smoothly opened the chest cavity, revealing spongy, pulmonary tissue heavily engorged with excess fluid. Microscopic analysis told the truly harrowing reality of the timeline. Dirty, untreated rainwater filled her deep air passages. The 27-year-old had been breathing erratically, desperately gasping for oxygen when the heavy wooden lid slid shut above her. Complete, suffocating darkness consumed her final moments, while she remained fully conscious beneath the surface. Something else was distinctly wrong with the physical remains. Forensics noted an aggressive, reddish-purple friction burn wrapping tightly around the back of her pale neck. Raw tissue formed a thin, continuous ring just above the collarbone. Danielle religiously wore a thick, highly recognizable gold locket. It served as a staple of her daily uniform, familiar to anyone buying bait or black coffee at the isolated trading post. Now, that metal chain was completely gone, violently snatched away just seconds before the plunge. Missing jewelry instantly mutated the narrative. A crime of seemingly pure, unadulterated rage suddenly contained the cold calculus of robbery. Or perhaps this petty theft acted as a crude smokescreen designed to obscure a much more intimate motive. Detectives immediately zeroed in on the closest men in her orbit. Two very different individuals were dragged into Windowless, Cinderblock holding cells at the sheriff's department. Inside room A, the ex-husband sat rigid, picking anxiously at the fraying fabric of his denim jeans. His knuckles were entirely clean, completely devoid of the jagged defensive scratches usually inflicted by a desperate woman fighting for survival. Down the narrow hallway in room B, Danielle's current, significantly younger boyfriend nervously tapped his boot heel against the scuffed linoleum floor. Harsh fluorescent bulbs illuminated a single bead of sweat, tracing the sharp angle of his jawline. Investigators pressed both subjects relentlessly. They tossed unredacted crime scene photos onto the scratched aluminum tables, watching the men's pupils dilate in genuine, unprepared shock. The interrogation spaces reeked heavily of burnt pot coffee, cheap tobacco, and nervous adrenaline. Hours ticked by. Squeaking metal chair legs and the dull hum of the ventilation system provided the only soundtrack to the grueling questioning. Science and paper trails ultimately provided undeniable protection for both suspects. Industrial time cards placed the ex-spouse exactly 3 counties away, punching out of a chaotic factory shift. Security cameras captured him flawlessly, covered in grease and nowhere near Blackwood Valley. Meanwhile, the younger boyfriend possessed a pocketful of crumpled, time-stamped diner receipts. An exhausted night shift waitress corroborated his exact movements down to the minute. Their alibis proved absolutely airtight. Neither of them carried a single, microscopic speck of wet Appalachian clay on their boot treads. Defeated, the task force stared blankly at the precinct whiteboard, crossing a thick red marker through the 2 most statistically probable names. Whoever bashed in Danielle's skull and dragged her to a watery grave wasn't a jealous lover or a bitter ex. This predator remained a ghost. If the men who claimed to love her didn't plunge her into that concrete tomb, exactly who was standing on her property in the dead of night? The squeal of a black dry erase marker ripping across the precinct whiteboard set teeth on edge. Detective Miller aggressively crossed out the ex-husband and the younger boyfriend. Dead ends. The windowless room smelled faintly of ozone from a dying copy machine mixed with days-old, sour perspiration. They desperately required a new net, a much wider dragnet. The sheriff barked a hoarse order that sent exhausted uniforms trudging back out into the relentless West Virginia rain. Their mandate dictated knocking on every warped pine door within a 5-mile radius of the Lawson trading post. Pounding on rusted screen frames yielded a mountain of petty rural secrets. But eventually, the mud-caked boots of the canvas team kicked up 3 highly specific anomalies. Outsiders. Men who did not belong to the daily rhythm of Blackwood Valley, having recently drifted back from out of state just before the spring flooding trapped everyone inside. Deputies physically dragged the first 2 into the fluorescent glare of the station. These particular subjects were rough, exhausted labourers. One reeked heavily of cheap wintergreen chewing tobacco and unleaded gasoline. The other incessantly picked at grease-stained cuticles until they bled. They sat in the cramped holding cells, spitting into styrofoam cups, willingly offering up their hourly movements. Local foremen vouched for them. Punch time cards cleared their nights completely. Their airtight alibis held firm under the intense heat of the interrogator's desk lamp. Frustrated, the authorities let them walk back into the damp afternoon. That process left a single, glaring, empty metal chair in Room A, Leon Hayes. A former local boy who had supposedly relocated to Texas years ago, only to quietly slip back into the isolated holler a mere week before Danielle Lawson's lungs filled with dirty rainwater. Pulling his jacket from the state database produced a dense, heavy manila folder. The wrinkled pages documented a brutal, escalating history. He had served 2 full years inside a maximum security penitentiary for aggravated assault. This was a predator accustomed to using his fists to silence minor frustrations. Cruisers tore down the waterlogged gravel road, fishtailing violently toward the address listed for Leon's closest relative. His elderly aunt resided a mere mile from the victim's bait shop. Law enforcement found her front door, swinging loose on a broken iron hinge, slapping rhythmically against the rotting wooden frame. Inside the dim living space, the old woman sat frozen in a faded armchair, clutching a moth-eaten knitted shawl, staring blankly at the television static. She hadn't seen her nephew since the previous night. A sagging canvas cot occupied the enclosed back porch. The thin wool blanket lay rumpled, smelling strongly of stale beer malt and unwashed denim. A single, dented tin ashtray overflowed with nervously crushed cigarette butts. While the county deputy had been shining his flashlight down at Danielle's pale reflection in the concrete water tank, Leon was already actively moving. He carried no luggage. No vehicle was borrowed to facilitate an escape. The deep tread marks matching the clay impressions at the crime scene tracked away from the wooden deck, pointing directly toward the interstate. Following those indented boot prints down the shoulder of Route 19, investigators watched the physical trail simply evaporate into the dense, grey, morning fog. 0 drops of blood marked the wet asphalt. Not a single piece of dropped gold jewellery offered a directional clue. Just an abrupt, maddening end on the highway line. How does a violent ex-con completely dissolve into thin air, with a murdered woman's locket burning a hole in his pocket, leaving an entire federal task force chasing phantoms in the Appalachian mist? Heavy gold slammed against scratched plexiglass with a dull, sickening clink. 48 hours after Danielle Lawson exhaled her final breath of stagnant rainwater, a violently trembling hand shoved her recognizable jewelry across a greasy display counter. The roadside pawn shop, located 2 counties over from Blackwood Valley, reeked of cheap cigar ash and unwashed denim. Security footage captured a hulking figure matching Leon Hayes' exact dimensions, pacing the narrow linoleum aisle. His jacket hung soaked from the relentless spring storms. Dark Appalachian mud caked his heavy work boots, slowly melting into brown puddles on the floorboards. The cashier behind the iron grate barely glanced up, oblivious to the fact that he was handling a dead woman's necklace. Snatching a single, crumpled $50 bill from the clerk's fingers, The ex-con spun on his heel and pushed back out into the grey, blinding downpour. $50. That pathetic sum was the established exchange rate for crushing a disabled shopkeeper's skull and drowning her in the dark. Federal marshals moved with violent speed to capitalize on the financial breadcrumb. Black SUVs tore through the waterlogged mountain passes, their sirens muffled by the deafening roar of overflowing riverbanks. Tactical boots kicked down the rotting wooden doors of known associates and distant relatives hiding in the backwoods. Every raided trailer smelled of stale beer and fresh bleach, yet yielded absolutely nothing but empty mattresses and scattered cigarette ash. Nature herself seemed to be actively protecting the fugitive. Severe flooding washed out the primary arterial highways, transforming the secluded hollers into an impassable, muddy trap for law enforcement vehicles. 2007 wasn't an era of instant digital tracking or ubiquitous cellular towers pinging GPS locations. Lawmen relied on fax machines spitting out grainy, high-contrast mugshots that dissolved into useless black ink blobs when handed to sleepy gas station attendants along the interstate. By the time the floodwaters finally receded, Hayes had effectively evaporated. He slipped seamlessly through the massive analog cracks of the national database, leaving zero financial footprint or forward-facing address. Detectives pinned his smudged photograph to the center of the precinct corkboard, a constant reminder of their failure. Weeks bled agonizingly into months. Spring mud hardened into cracked summer clay, which eventually buried itself under suffocating winter snowdrifts. The physical evidence locked inside the basement vault slowly gathered a thick layer of dust. Lead investigators stared at the missing poster so often that the suspect's dead, flat eyes burned into the back of their eyelids every time they tried to sleep in their own beds. An entire decade ground past the rusted hinges of the isolated trading post. Danielle's cabin remained entirely abandoned, the wooden shutters permanently warped shut by the damp valley air, the cistern left completely dry. Bureaucrats officially classified the binder as a cold case, relegating the dense paperwork to a cardboard box in the archives. Yet, the rural residents of Blackwood never forgot the metallic tang of that contaminated rainwater. Neighbours who previously left their screen doors wide open to catch the evening breeze began installing heavy iron deadbolts and motion sensor floodlights. Pump-action shotguns sat fully loaded beside faded living room armchairs. The community understood a grim, unresolved reality. Somewhere out there in the vast American expanse, a man who murders for a handful of pocket change was still walking around, breathing free air. If 15 years pass without a single whisper, does the monster eventually believe he actually got away with it? Splintering fiberglass and the deafening, concussive boom of a battering ram ruptured the stagnant Texas heat. A specialized federal extraction team flooded the interior of a rusting, sun-baked, single-wide trailer parked just beyond Houston's city limits. Acrid grey smoke, tasting distinctly of burnt magnesium from a deployed flashbang, choked the narrow hallway corridor. Tactical boots forcefully pinned a greying, 47-year-old man, face down, onto sticky, beer-stained linoleum. Exactly 15 years had completely evaporated since a disabled Appalachian shopkeeper took her final, desperate breath of contaminated rainwater. Today, the calendar read August 5th, 2022. Danielle Lawson should have been celebrating her 42nd birthday. Instead, the universe finally delivered a highly overdue, violently executed warrant to her killer. Marshals hauled Leon Hayes out of the oppressive southern humidity and into an aggressively air-conditioned holding room. Frost coated the iron ventilation grates above, humming with a continuous, rattling mechanical drone. The aging fugitive offered zero resistance. Decades spent frantically checking every single rearview mirror had entirely hollowed his physical frame. Dark, sagging pockets of skin hung beneath his bloodshot pupils. Nicotine-stained fingernails trembled uncontrollably against the scratched metal interrogation table, tapping an erratic, panicked rhythm. He smelled sour, radiating the distinct odour of stale bourbon, mixed with primal, unwashed terror. When lead investigators silently slid a faded, water-damaged 2007 crime scene photograph across the desk, the suspect's posture completely disintegrated. The crushing, suffocating gravity of the Blackwood Valley Mountains finally broke his spine. True malevolence rarely operates like a brilliant, calculated cinematic plot. Most often, horror stems from something pathetically trivial. Hayes wept openly, his raspy voice scraping through the dry, manufactured air as he surrendered the nightmarish reality of that forgotten timeline. Relentless midnight precipitation had been drumming against the West Virginia pine trees back in '07. Severely intoxicated, physically agitated, and completely out of cigarettes, the drifter stumbled blindly up to the secluded trading post. Aggressive, rhythmic pounding on the reinforced exterior door eventually forced the sleeping woman out from under her warm quilts. Danielle unlatched the heavy deadbolt, her face twisting in obvious exhaustion and profound irritation at the belligerent late-night intrusion. She flatly refused to open her cash register just to appease a drunk demanding tobacco. Rejection acts as a highly volatile trigger mechanism for a dangerously fragile ego. A sudden, blinding surge of irrational fury hijacked the ex-con's central nervous system completely. Before any shred of logical restraint could intervene, his closed fist collided violently with her jawline. The 27-year-old collapsed heavily onto the rough floorboards, struggling to inhale. Instant panic rapidly consumed the attacker's initial wave of anger. Recognizing the catastrophic legal implications of assaulting a beloved local, Hayes made a cold, utterly permanent calculation. Grabbing the semi-conscious victim by her cotton nightgown, he hauled her dead weight out into the freezing, relentless downpour. Saturated clay sucked greedily at his work boots. The deafening storm effectively masked the sickening, abrasive scrape of her bare heels dragging across the loose driveway gravel. Rough, calloused palms shoved the massive iron-banded lid off the concrete water supply. Muscle strain burned his shoulders as he hoisted her limp, bruised form over the rough masonry edge. A hollow, echoing splash resonated from the pitch-black depths below. Right as she began slipping downward into the freezing liquid, greedy fingers lunged forward, violently ripping the signature gold chain from her throat. Raw friction burned her skin. The wooden cover slid securely back into place, plunging a living, breathing human being into a completely sealed, lightless tomb, while her damaged lungs frantically searched for non-existent oxygen. He successfully traded a vibrant community fixture for a stolen $50 trinket and a temporarily bruised sense of pride. The detective reached forward, pressing the plastic stop button on the digital audio recorder with a sharp, definitive click. Justice didn't arrive via a dramatic courtroom monologue. It materialized inside a bleak, windowless room containing a broken old man wearing a soiled undershirt. A 15-year tab had eventually come due, paid in full over a denied pack of Marlboros.